So excited to kick it off. And yeah, super thrilled to be joined by Esben. Esben, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello everyone. Great to see you all here. I'm Esben. I'm one of the founders of Userflow. Userflow is an in-app onboarding builder. I'll tell more about that. Prior to Userflow, I founded another company called Cobalt, which is a cybersecurity SaaS company. And in both companies, I've worked on the go-to-market part of sites and build out product-led motions and so on. So very excited to speak more about how you can nail user onboarding with Userflow and LogRocket today.
Awesome. Yeah, Esben is a total expert on this topic. So yeah, my intro, I'm Berner. I'm one of the growth managers here at LogRocket. Been with this company for about 4 years now. And previously before that was with an electronic health records company. So a bit more old school, but still in the software world. And yeah, I've done a lot of different things at LogRocket, but one of the projects that was pretty relevant to this topic had to do with our account-based marketing program. We actually went and signed up for and onboarded into over 1,000 different software products over the past 3 or 4 years. So a really good mix of like B2B SaaS, consumer software, pretty much anything you can think of. So we've seen a lot of really crazy things when it comes to user onboarding flows, and excited to really dig into this topic. So to kind of set the stage, we'll both briefly introduce LogRocket and then Userflow. So LogRocket, our overall mission is to help software teams build better digital experiences. And the way that we do that is by telling you everything you need to know about the way that users are experiencing your products. So I think probably the most relevant to today's talk will be this piece around product analytics, which has to do with optimizing for important product OKRs like conversion rates and user adoption. But these other pieces are also super important to this topic as well. And we'll see a few examples of how they're all intertwined and how they all relate. This idea of issues just has to do with identifying things that you might not know that are areas of friction or potentially technical problems with your products. And then the idea of sessions, which is this concept of session replay. We'll see a few examples later on in the presentation, but this can be very useful for solving and contextualizing user-reported issues. And we'll see a few examples of how these all relate to one another as well. And then Userflow.
Yeah, so Userflow is on the guidance part of things. So what you can do with Userflow is basically build in-app guidance for your product. So things like in-app product tours, checklists, surveys, resource center widgets, etc. It's all no code. So you can build it if you're like a product manager or customer success manager. You can build basically in-app onboarding content without involving developers. The typical use cases for Userflow onboarding is that you want to maybe increase conversion for your free trial or freemium, or you want to increase retention for your existing users. So it's really a powerful tool for building in-app onboarding and much more.
Awesome. Thanks for the intro there. And then, yeah, so this is what we'll go through today, kind of setting the stage just with a few reasons why we think that user onboarding is particularly important to get right in today's environment. Of course, it's always been important. Why it's actually so challenging and difficult to do this really well. And then how we think that teams can get this right and how LogRocket and Userflow can play into that and help you in your success. All right, so I think the first thing that's important to consider when we're talking about why this matters is choice is rising a lot. As digital adoption goes up across the board, more and more software products are popping up every single day. And what you're looking at here is the number of listings in a few different G2 categories that Userflow and LogRocket fall into. And you can see there's quite a few options that consumers can evaluate. There's 64 session replay listings, which is up from probably around 10 when our company was founded in 2016. It's really good for consumers to have this many options to work with. But the scary thing for us as software providers is the sad truth is we're simply not going to get an at-bat with every person who's looking into a software product like ours. So what can we do to really maximize our odds of success when we are lucky enough to get an at-bat? And one thing that I think is also really important to call out here is buying behavior is changing, particularly in the past 5 to 10 years. We no longer get to talk to all of our users, which presents a whole set of challenges. Gartner has done some research around this and found buyers are completing up to 60% of their buying process before they ever engage with a vendor. And a big part of that pre-call research that they're doing is actually exploring trials and playing around with our products themselves. So if we no longer have the opportunity to kind of control the narrative around these evaluations through a traditional sales-led cycle, the products need to speak for themselves, which is really important. And that's what we'll get into in just a second. And then, yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this. I think probably everyone here on the call does, but Esben, what have you seen? Like, why is this so hard to do right?
Yeah, I think so. It's great that all these buying behaviors are changing. So now we can move to fixing it in the product and really building great product-led onboarding. But the problem today is that many software businesses don't have this great onboarding. A lot of software as a service businesses, when the first time you log into their product, there's basically no form of guidance. You basically just land on a blank slate and have to figure everything out. Or another thing that happens is you end up on a software platform and there's way too much going on. So you're also just confused about what you should do. A rule of thumb is that 40 to 60% of users leave your product and never come back after the first day. So it's really important that you guide them to understand your product as fast as possible. Another common kind of pitfall in when it comes to software products is that there is too much friction. Basically, there's some kind of friction that stops the user from achieving what they were looking to do with your tool. And this kind of friction adds annoyance, and it's another big reason why customers don't come back. And then finally, bad UX. I mean, in a product-led world, and especially when it comes to onboarding, it's super important that your UX is really, really good and that you don't have like basic UX challenges that annoys the customer, annoys the user. Again, this can lead to the user never coming back to your product. So these are like common challenges that we see with software services today and why many onboarding processes for software fails.
It's definitely super saddening to see those people come and never come back after the first day. It's worst nightmare for a marketer like me. So yeah, I think on the other side of this, there's also this challenge around the need for observability with regards to what's working, what's not working, and what kind of unforeseen challenges your users are running into as they try to onboard into your product. So I think as a baseline, most product teams have a pretty good idea of their funnels, what steps are problematic and where users are dropping out through that form of quantitative analytics. But it still leaves behind a lot of blind spots. If you're just seeing, between step 2 and step 3, there's a declining conversion rate. You kind of have some educated assumptions as to what might be going wrong, but really being able to have observability on the individual level through that kind of qualitative data that LogRocket provides, and then the knowledge of why this drop-off is occurring is really critical to being able to actually action what you're getting through your standard analytics. So this is the framework that we would encourage everyone to try to think through, this idea of guidance, observation, and optimization. So when you put all of these together, it creates a very effective kind of continuous cycle of improvements where we come into it probably with some assumptions around where our users are struggling, what's going wrong, guide them towards those aha moments and the points that we want them to complete within the flows, observe what's working, both with that guidance strategy and just with the product itself, and then optimize from there. So we'll go into each individual piece of that, starting off with Esben talking about guidance.
Yeah, so how do you actually go about building great onboarding? So the first step, if you go to the next slide, is basically to identify what are those aha moments? What are the moments that where the user experiences the value of your product for the first time? Typically, it's not just one moment, it's a series of moments that you have to identify. A great way to do that is, of course, to go and talk with your users. So this can be like just asking them, why did you buy? This can be either prospect users or users who just bought your product. And then you can combine that with data from different tools. And that could, for instance, be to observe sessions using LogRocket to see common traits. You can look at more quantitative analytics in tools like Amplitude. You can look at the onboarding tools like Userflow. And then finally, you can combine it with ICP data that you could get from tools like Clearbit. It's important that you don't only look at what are the value realizations, but also look at who is the user having those value realizations. It's super important to know your ideal customer profile. Next slide. Then when you have those aha moments, you can start building your guidance with a tool like Userflow. And many kind of get stuck here and says, oh, it's very hard to build our onboarding. But really what I think you should do is that you should start with something simple and then go from there. So the first baseline setup you can build is a setup where you initially welcome the user to your platform. You can do that with a welcome modal or similar, where you basically just say hello and give a short intro to your product. You can, as an advanced add-on to that welcome modal, ask a question or two, for instance, about their use case, etc., so you can further personalize your onboarding. Then as the second step, you can guide the user to the first aha moment. And that's typically the most kind of critical aha moment you want to guide them towards. In Userflow, as an example, our most critical aha moment is to show how easy it is to build these kind of onboarding guides with Userflow. So our very first guide is a guide that guides users to build an onboarding guide on their own. Then the third step is to guide to additional aha. A great way to do that is by having a checklist where the user can go through the different tasks. So you can basically run through different tasks here and then have a guide associated with each of those tasks. So this is a great kind of baseline setup for doing onboarding. Next slide. One thing that's super important when you build the onboarding is that you make it action-driven. So a common mistake that many make is they make these kind of boring product tours that is like, here's feature X, here's feature Y, here's feature C, next. Those are great for like explaining your entire UI and explaining your product, but the user don't get a lot of like value realization from that. They might get a bit, but they don't get to experience anything on their own. It's much more engaging and better to do action-driven onboarding, where you get the users to do actions like create X, launch Y, configure C, so the user can really see they can do this with your tool and do it themselves. So that's a very important part to building onboarding. Next slide. Another important thing to that is to make your onboarding content clear and concise. You shouldn't just assume that users know exactly what to do. For instance, if you point a tooltip to something, make it very clear what the action is. As in this example where it says click add block to add a trigger, it's super important that you add that text. If that text wasn't there, even though the tooltip was pointing to the element, it's not natural for a user to necessarily click on that element, even though you might think it is. So it's very important to be very clear about the actions you want the user to take. Next slide.
Esben, we have a really interesting question in the chat here.
Yep.
What if your product, oh, can you see that? So yeah, the question is, what if your product is rather complex and requires a lot of upfront investment to get to an aha moment? What would you recommend? Yeah,
no, that's a great question. I think it's always about thinking, how can I achieve something, even though I have a complex product, how can I get the user to some kind of aha moment, either by simplifying the scope of the product, by making the flow or guidance flow a bit more set, right? As a Userflow, as an example, you can technically build all sorts of things with Userflow, right? And there could be many possibilities for what you want to build. But with Userflow, we really make a very fixed guide to begin with about how you build a onboarding guide. And that's not the guide that users are going to use, but it's a guide that shows the different capabilities of Userflow. So I think it's about reducing scope a bit for your onboarding, and then also making it a bit more fixed. Don't try to build guidance where the user have a lot of variables and can do whatever they want necessarily. It's sometimes enough to show a good example to drive them to the aha moment.
Well, there's another one in the chat actually, Esben, is Userflow suited for high versus low touch users, meaning one-to-one support or more one-to-many model for CS, for example?
Yeah, so Userflow is in-app onboarding, right? So it's tech touch. So it's not a tool where you do like high touch, but even though if you have a high touch model, you can use Userflow as an add-on to that. So you can remove a lot of the onboarding that is done by people by having in-app onboarding, right? So I think Userflow is great both in a low touch model and in a high touch model, because in the low touch, it can completely remove the need to have people involved. And in the high touch, it can reduce the need to have people involved. So I think it can be used in both worlds, basically.
Cool. Makes perfect sense.
Cool. So now that you have a great baseline onboarding guide, you made it clear and concise and action-driven, then you have to look at, of course, your product itself and look at, is there any friction today that we have that is kind of unnecessary? You might have some friction that is necessary, which is things that actually adds value to the customer, things that they have to go through to experience the value, but you likely also have a lot of unnecessary friction points. A common example for most SaaS businesses is the sign-up process, where you typically, for security purposes, have some kind of email process for verifying the email. A great way to do that without having to verify an email is to do things like sign up with Google. In that way, users can sign up with a single click instead of to have to go through an email process. Using Userflow as an example, we have a JavaScript snippet that you need to install in your application to really get it working for end users. But most of our trial users are product managers or customer success managers, so they don't have access to developers and can't install that code. But we want to show them the value before they involve developers. And in order to do that, what we did was to add a Chrome extension that basically allows the users to preview and build content with the Chrome extension locally, so they don't have to install the JavaScript snippet before they actually decide that this is a great tool and this is a tool they can kind of go onwards with, and then they can involve developers. In that way, we removed the friction of involving developers too early. And I'm sure if you went through your flows, you would be able to find similar friction points in your application. Next slide. And
I know that we can relate to that.
Yeah, I think that's a great cue over to Will, because the next step you do after you have all this guidance in place and you have tried to remove most of your friction, and even before you do that, is to start observing, and Will can speak more to that. Yeah,
thank you. And I think Luke and I might actually have to steal your idea of a public Chrome extension, because we have the same struggle with getting people to install JavaScript, where it can be challenging to do so. All right, yeah, so pivoting to the topic of observability. So this will be the next step in the cycle. And like I mentioned before, quantitative analytics are fantastic and absolutely necessary, but they don't tell you the entire story. And this is an example of an onboarding funnel from LogRocket's own onboarding flow, where users first start out and they visit this URL containing quick start. And what we want them to do to get to that first critical aha moment of value realization is to actually record a session replay and then view back that session replay. That's what we need people to be doing. But all we really know here is we're only getting 25% of users We know it's kind of a lift because you have to install the JavaScript snippet, so maybe we can make some optimizations there. But what else is happening here between these two steps where we can make an immediate impact and get some quick wins? That's really the question. And that's where this idea of the observability that LogRocket can provide really comes into play. And I'll go through one example of each of these, but I think probably the most important is the visual context, which is the session replay, which is the core LogRocket feature. It's basically being able to watch as if you're looking over your user's shoulder and seeing every action they take, where they might be confused, where they're struggling, and where there might be unforeseen issues. Also, this idea of written feedback, which most of you are probably familiar with. It's just a simple NPS survey, it's something that LogRocket offers, where you can provide very specific prompts seeking numerical feedback and written feedback from your users. And then this idea of frustration signals, which is the newest of these three, and it's one of the most powerful because it can show you where you have issues that you had no idea about. So a frustration signal, it's basically something that a user might be doing or some kind of an indication that they're going through a frustrating user experience. One example of that would be rage clicking on a button when something isn't loading and you're getting really angry and clicking 1,000 times, or thrashing the mouse, something like that. And we'll look at an example of that in a moment. All right, so the first example here has to do with the session replay, the visual context. So I pulled this example from one of the onboarding flows that I navigated through as part of that account-based marketing project that I mentioned earlier. And so where we might start as like a product manager is looking at something like this. Maybe you have Heap or Pendo, some kind of an analytics product that's telling you, we have a problem between step 3 and step 4 of this onboarding flow, where users are clicking the button continue, but they're not continuing to actually click sign up and finish that flow. So that's bad. We want to know why. We don't want to just know how many. So it's really easy to isolate users who did not or did complete the desired action, and from there, jump into their video replay. And this is a real example of a session that I captured on the Gym Pass sign-up flow. And it's actually very interesting. So you see, they're prompting me to enter my organization's name. I go ahead and type an input into this field, and we get this very sad and unfortunate looking error message here telling us that we can't continue. There's also some weird like shakiness on the page. So this is obviously not something that we like to see as product managers. That's a clear UX flaw, and it's really problematic. Any user who gets that is not going to be able to continue on to the next step. So this is where being able to go into on an individual level to those experiences and see what things might be contributing to that failed conversion, it can be very, very powerful. And then moving on to an example of how written feedback can be applied to user onboarding. This is a real example from our onboarding flow here at LogRocket, where we used our own feedback collection widget to request feedback for users who are going through that flow. And I think there are a few things it's important to take note of in order to get good results here. You need to be targeted to start. If you just reach out to a user who's been in your application for 2 years and ask them what they thought about your onboarding experience, they're probably not going to answer. They probably don't remember, and it probably doesn't look anything like it did at that point in time anyways. So being able to be very targeted with LogRocket, you can essentially just say users who are on this URL, which is associated with the onboarding flow, should receive this particular message. Maybe you want to set a sampling threshold, and then being very specific in your ask as to what you want to gather information about. So in this case, we were asking, how satisfied are you with your onboarding experience? And basically going on to say, we want to know anything that's on your mind, like have at it. And these are some of the examples that we got, which was useful just to kind of confirm some of our hypotheses, which was that we have the same problem that Esben and Userflow have, where we're working with people like product managers, growth marketers, and most of the time they don't have access to install a script into their application. So that's a big point of friction. We ended up taking a slightly different approach to it than Esben did with his Chrome extension, and we'll actually get to that in a second as well. And then finally, the last flavor of observability that I want to mention here is this idea of frustration signals. And this is something that can be stacked on top of very detailed targeting. So in this case, we're looking for frustration signals on our quick start URL. I don't know how many people on the call have used some kind of session replay tool, but in the past, what a lot of people have said is it's extremely useful when you find something interesting, but it can be hard to do so. And sometimes it's almost like looking for a needle in a haystack, trying to find the sessions that matter. So here we're able to show these are the sessions on the part of the app that you care about, the onboarding flow, where this kind of frustrating experience occurred. And this is an example of a real user on our onboarding flow who had a very unfortunate experience. And I'll show you all what that looked like. So as you can imagine, this is not what the page is supposed to look like. It's just a spinning infinite loading wheel, and the user should be seeing the first page of our quick start guide, where we would ask them, what's your role, and go through a few questions while onboarding them into the product. And this was an instance of a frustrating network request, which is one of those signals that is associated with a poor user experience. And in this case, it absolutely was, because this took, I think, about 4 minutes for the page to load. And I'm sure that this user was up and running in our competitor's platform by the time the page loaded, which is very sad. All right, and then I'll explain to you guys kind of the approach that we took, and just an example of how we use Userflow. It was that same problem that Esben described, where we have users who are PMs or marketers who can't install the script. So what can we do? Historically, they would just get this scary pop-up that covers the entire dashboard and says, awaiting recordings, you can't do anything until you install the script. And that's just sad. So our idea was to build an interactive sandbox environment complete with dummy data. Anyone can access it and play around with our session replay tool, our metric suite, and do anything they want in it, really. But that introduced a whole new set of challenges, because kind of inherently, we're not talking to these people. We don't have the opportunity to take them on a guided demo and walk them through the product. So we need to find a way to introduce our core functionality and direct those users towards the aha moments. And that's where we turn to Userflow to implement some in-app guides. And like Esben mentioned, it's very important to focus on utility rather than just feature dumping as you point users to the different capabilities of your product. For example, when we talked about our issues feature, we tried to contextualize it and say, here's where you'll find negative UX events. I think people would be interested in knowing where there are negative UX events on their onboarding flows or on their products generally. That's something that you can immediately understand why it would be valuable. And then just being very intentional about pushing our users directly towards the critical aha moments. In this case, we're guiding users to create their first custom metric, which actually it's not the first aha moment for us. It's one of the secondary aha moments that has been mentioned, but it is almost equally as important. So we were sure to do that. And then Esben touched on this already, so I won't go into too much detail, but it was really important to us that this was extremely easy to use and that we could build it ourselves without having to rely on one of our growth engineers. We were able to get these tours up and running within an afternoon of working on it, which was just really incredible and led to some great results for us. And then Esben, I think you have a story about how you use LogRocket.
Yeah, so we've been happy users of LogRocket for actually a couple of years now. And some of the challenges we wanted to explore with LogRocket was really what UX problems are users facing during our initial onboarding. And a second one was actually also to look at this kind of aha moments and what's in common, what are common data points for trial users, accounts that ends up converting. So what we ended up doing was to use LogRocket to observe free trial users and see where they were challenged in the onboarding and general UX of Userflow, and also to identify common traits for users who convert. One thing that's great that we didn't have in the beginning, but we have now, so I'm happy to announce that, is we can now show Userflow content in LogRocket. So before you could only show your application, but now you can also see the actual Userflow content. So even when we implemented Userflow content, we could also review that with LogRocket, which is a great capability. So let's dive into some of the findings we found using LogRocket and how we solved them. One of the first findings we did was that we discovered that a lot of our trial users were not able to always see that they needed to connect steps. If they didn't go through that initial onboarding with Userflow that we recommend everybody does, they would just skip that, then they wouldn't learn about that. And then we had a UX gap in our product that didn't make it clear enough that you needed to do that. So if you look at this screenshot, it might be a bit hard to see. Then users would just add steps, but they wouldn't connect them. And then they would be confused about why is the flow not working? But of course, the steps needs to be connected for the flow to work. So what we did to solve that was to make it really clear, as you can see in the screenshot, with a red kind of highlight and an error message if a step was not connected, and then we explain how you can connect it. So in that way, we solved that UX issue, and we haven't really seen that from that point on. Another finding we did, if you move to the next slide, is that we looked at one of our Userflow flows, and we saw that that was breaking due to a pop-up from our own app blocking the next step. So on a certain screen size, that pop-up was blocking. So what we ended up doing there was to fix it by actually using one of the Userflow actions, which is the capability to do evaluate JavaScript. So what we did when the user went to the next step is that we ran a JavaScript action that closed all pop-ups. In that way, that pop-up would never block the next step in the flow. So in that way, we learned from LogRocket something that was not working in our onboarding flow, and then we went in and fixed it. And then to the last challenge.
Have a question. Oh, sorry,
yeah,
Esben, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
There was just a question in the chat. What impact does LogRocket have on page performance, since it's sending every request and snapshots of the user's journey? So yeah, it's a really good question. And there's a few ways we handle it. So we pass the data via a worker thread to avoid blocking the main thread of your application. And it's done asynchronously. So there are a few different ways that we take. It's something that we're very cognizant of, because we do also have a performance monitoring feature. So yeah, we're here to help you optimize performance, not to degrade it. So happy to chat about that in more detail if that helps.
Yeah, same goes for the Userflow JavaScript snippet. It's very lightweight, shouldn't cause any issues. The last finding I just want to share is a finding related to looking at those common traits for users. And what we realized by looking at, among other things, LogRocket data, was that accounts that convert tend to go through our initial onboarding and end up spending 30-minute plus building. So that became kind of our metric for identifying PQA, PQLs, among other things, but that became our key metric. And one great thing about LogRocket is you can actually filter on those users. So you can create a segment where you just look at the users who spent more than 30 minutes. And in that way, you can really look at the engaged trial users and what they have done and learn from that. So yeah, LogRocket has been very valuable for us to observe our onboarding and really improve it. So that's it for me.
Cool. Yeah, it's been a very fruitful relationship, I think, for the both of us, which we're very grateful for here. And yeah, so to kind of summarize this and wrap things up, we like to think of this as kind of a continuous cycle. So representative of the flywheel graphic that you see here, where you're never truly finished or done with this process. Over time, the needs of your users are continually changing. Your product itself is often changing. And we just really have to make sure that we stay on top of this through proper guidance, a cycle of guidance, observation, and optimization, and you should get some pretty good results from that. So that is pretty much it. So we'll open it up if there are any other questions, and I put our emails here on the slide as well if anyone cares to reach out to either myself or Esben. But yeah, I'd be glad to answer any other questions that the chat might have.
Great.
I suppose we must have answered them all already.
Yeah, that's that's good.
Oh, wait,
maybe
there is
now.
one.
Yeah.
Oh, can you compare this to Pendo? Yes, we'd be happy to. I think the primary differentiator between LogRocket and Pendo is the session replay element. Oh yeah, no, it's okay. We'd be happy to chat more about it in detail as well. But the session replay is really the core differentiator, where if you remember the slide where we went and jumped from that kind of quantitative analytics chart into the actual individual experiences, and being able to link those together to get more insight about how our users are experiencing our product and what types of things are contributing to those aggregated trends. And then
maybe I can also,
question,
because Pendo is actually also a competitor to Userflow, so they also do in-app guides, and the main difference there is for Userflow guides are just much more advanced. We're 100% focused on building in-app onboarding, where Pendo has that divided focus, right? So we have a really advanced tool with a much better UX, much higher level of sophistication, and I think if you do a free trial, that's also what you will see. So yeah, we can also share a full comparison to Pendo on our website. So I think Pendo is kind of, you can say, alternative to the combination of Userflow and LogRocket, but I definitely think if you go with the combo instead of them, you get the best of both worlds instead of like a mixed product.
and we have a question also about, can you censor data in the session recordings to protect PII? And yes, absolutely. We have multiple ways of addressing that, either on a element by element basis, or we do have this concept of an auto sanitizer as well. So it kind of depends on, the specific configuration of your app, what option might be best for you. But we've worked with companies, everything from healthcare providers to banking companies. So definitely something that we've addressed.
Yeah. And then the last question I see here is, are there any integrations between LogRocket and Userflow to pass data onboarding step easily between each other? So currently, we don't have a data integration, but what we did enable recently was the capability to see Userflow content inside the LogRocket sessions. So you can set that up in the Userflow integration. So you can basically, as when you've built something and launched it in your app, you can then see the Userflow content inside LogRocket, similar to how you would see your own application. So that's been the first step, and we're very likely to build some more data integrations in the future to share events and so on. Yeah.
And then one more in the chat, I think for you, Esben, what guidance can you provide in implementing Userflow to compensate for complex or poor UX?
Yeah, no, I mean, it should never be the permanent solution to use Userflow for that. You should always, of course, look for how can we solve UX in the product, and then more use Userflow as a guidance on top of already great UX. But yeah, you can definitely use Userflow as a kind of stopgap solution. So you should really think about how can I really guide towards that single aha moment. So make those kind of guides very directive and easy to follow, right? So that's something you need to be very good at when you're using Userflow. But Userflow can be a great stopgap solution for solving for bad UX, but it should never be the permanent solution.
Yeah, and also if you might not be aware of exactly like what areas of your UX are struggling, then LogRocket would be a good option as well to identify some of those friction points or areas of poor UX.
Agree.
Cool. Any other questions from the group? All right, well, this has been a really fun time. I'm sure Esben and I could talk about this for hours and hours, but we wouldn't want to bore you all. So thank you everyone for joining us, and hope everyone has a good day.
Yeah, thanks.